I'm joined now by the Sunday Times columnist Mark Urban. Hello, Mark.
Hello, Hugo.
Thanks very much for being with us. Look, can we start with, let's start militarily before we look at the wider ramifications. The airstrike that killed Iran's supreme leader, another fairly breathtaking expression of US and Israeli military power and intelligence.
Yes. Well, the critical bit obviously is the second part of that, the intelligence, which, the New York Times says came from the CIA, the intelligence that actually put Ayatollah Khamenei at that place at that time in the context of that meeting, which was the trigger for the start of this war. The Israelis, of course, carried out the actual strike. This has been the key over these past couple of years, these types of operation, particularly these decapitation operations, so-called, is knowing the when, the where, and the who. So yes, they had that information. I mean, quite what the consequences downstream will be, Iran having entered 40 days of official mourning, we don't know. I mean, there are certain types of action that they might not take until that mourning period is over. But I think the wider point is that Iranians who support the regime and their proxies across the region will all have taken this as a heavy blow and a huge provocation.
Yeah, I mean, look, trying to understand the scale of this, right? So over the weekend, the noises from the White House was that this could be over in days, and more recently, Trump's talking about 4 or 5 weeks. Could one make the case that this is, if you look at the scale of this is the strongest enemy, the strongest country that the US has gone to war with, perhaps since the end of World War II? And I mean, can they manage to drag this out for weeks?
Well, if we're looking at the sort of history of intervention in the Middle East, the war in 1991 to liberate Kuwait from Iraq was a much larger conflict in the sense that the Americans had put over 500,000 people into the region. That's 10 times the number they've got now. They had 6 aircraft carriers. Now they have 2 in the region, etc., etc., and a lot more fast jet strike aircraft, that kind of thing. So that was a military campaign on a much larger scale. And of course, it included that ground element going into Kuwait and the southern parts of Iraq. So America has done this within living memory, my living memory anyway, maybe not the younger listeners, operated on this scale. Now, in fact, the absence of large ground forces that would have taken obviously many months to ship out and prepare is one of the big open questions about what's going on now, because you might argue that the whole aim of this is to topple the regime, but if that causes some serious internal strife in the country and pleas by desperate people for American or other forces to come in and rescue them and stop them being massacred, America is not in a position to do that, whether or not it wants to. That fact that they're attempting to do this with a relatively smaller force and a more closely defined around air power and missiles and that type of thing is all part of what makes this a rather unique and unpredictable, I would say, experiment.
What kind of weaponry is Iran using in order to hit back at American bases and to hit other countries in the region?
Well, look, I think the first thing to say on this third morning is that what has happened since the war started is clearly what many people feared at various points in 2024 and last year, which was that an exchange of missiles between Israel and Iran, for example, or airstrikes and missiles, would lead to a broader regional conflict. What we now have is that broader regional conflict because it may well have been a sort of pre-planned Samson option, a kind of end of the regime or regime in danger type option that the Iranians seem to have initiated once their leadership was killed, which involves lashing out across the region, striking some of those Gulf states that actually we're trying really hard to stay out of this, and we're not letting the Americans used their bases to attack Iran, for example. And so, they've hit, I think, 9 countries across the region, and all of those members of what's called the Gulf Cooperation Council, which is effectively the Saudi-led local defense arrangement, have been struck. Kuwait, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, they've all been struck, even Oman, which was playing a mediating role. And now, of course, we've heard overnight of a drone landing near the British base in Cyprus. So things are going that far afield. Now, your question was about weaponry. It's the panoply of Iranian weaponry that we've seen since those first strikes that were made in October 24, if I'm not mistaken, by the Iranians against Israel. So you've got the heavy ballistic missiles that fly very fast, uh, peaking in outer space and coming back in, roaring down, with some of them with quite large warheads, able to sort of devastate residential neighborhoods, as we've seen in parts of Israel. And then you have the shorter range missiles. Now, I think the important point here is that a lot of those shorter range systems were not targeted last June by the Israelis because they couldn't hit Israel. But of course, a lot of those places like the United Arab Emirates or Bahrain are in range of those shorter range systems. So the Iranians have greatly expanded the range of missiles that they've used in carrying out these regional strikes. And they've also expanded the range of drones. Same thing applies. Certain drones which could make it to Israel or even Cyprus were used last time. Other ones were not. And we know overnight they've struck Saudi Arabian oil facilities on the Gulf Coast. Once again, a type of target at a range that they didn't hit in the conflict of last June, but which they now have done so using the weaponry that they can use. So in other words, the battle essentially now is American and Israeli air power orbiting over Iran, waiting for intelligence when, for example, a missile launcher is identified or a drone launch site, swooping down, attempting to destroy that before they can fire. And if they fail, then the Iranians fire and then hide the launchers or whatever. And that's going on hundreds of times a day as this develops. It's a very dynamic battle in which the availability of timely intelligence is key. And what you'd expect if the American and Israeli plans work out and their technology is dominant is that after a few days, the numbers might go down a bit. But, it's a very early moment to be really trying to analyze who has the upper hand right now.
I mean, one hears so much about the sort of vast number of relatively cheap drones that Iran has. Presumably, it's much more expensive for the US or Israel to shoot down one of these drones than it is for the Iranians to launch one. I'm just interested in how long America can keep doing this if this does stretch into weeks.
The question of how long is dependent on what the military experts call magazine depth. In other words, how many of these things have you got ready-made and in storage? Because these very advanced weapons like the Patriot or the Talon, which is the high altitude air defense weapon, which can actually shoot down incoming warheads in space, are of course extremely expensive, get ordered quite slowly. Around 20 to 30% of the existing stock the Americans had already been used up over the last few years, supporting Israel, supporting Ukraine, in the Yemeni context, etc., etc. So that's quite a big factor. And when I just said, the question of who has the upper hand. Now, I think for many people, well, it's obvious that the Americans and the Israelis with all these fighter aircraft and advanced technologies have the upper hand. Well, yes, they do in that sense. But this question about magazine depth and who can fight for longer is that perhaps one of the reasons Iran hasn't launched more missiles is that it's seeing itself as being involved in a marathon rather than a sprint. All of these now, I think, are quite key factors. And returning to your point about the cost, yes, it's true that a Shahed drone, of the type that we saw flying into the Bahrain US Navy headquarters, or indeed one of the hotels in Dubai, is a cheap thing. I mean, it might be $40,000, $50,000 to make. And clearly, if you use a $2 million missile to shoot it down, as the UAE has been doing with some of them, that's not a very rational transaction. But think of it another way. If that $50,000 Shahed drone impacts in your oil refinery or in a part of the Dubai International Airport, which was hit yesterday, that causes huge damage in the tens of millions or even hundreds of millions of dollars, then firing off these very advanced weapons to bring down, particularly missiles, drones, I think is a different question, whether there aren't better ways of doing it, as the Ukrainians have found, then becomes a sort of rational economic transaction.
Where should we be looking if this conflict is likely to spread? We know that Israel's already attacking Lebanon in response to strikes from Hezbollah. Where else on the ground could there be sort of contagion of this conflict?
Well, I mean, in terms literally of the sort of list of countries now involved, it's already expanded almost as wide as one could reasonably have expected it to. I mean, it's possible. I don't believe Iran has attacked Turkey for, I think, probably fairly good, political reasons. But you could make the same argument that American aircraft use Turkish bases, even if it's just for support functions, that the Iranians have made against several of the other countries they've been firing at. So they have been lashing out pretty far and wide in terms of their targets over the last 3 days. I think the question when you mentioned on the ground, Hugo, I think then the question is, might we see actions, for example, from the popular mobilization forces, the militias that are backed by Iran in Iraq? They're very numerous. Whereas their proxy armies collapsed in Syria after the government fell there, they still have quite a large proxy